Hello, gang. Tattooed Biker here with you. And this evening, I've got 4 shocking true stories sent in by viewers that detail their personal encounters with unidentified or cryptid creatures. Now, while all these stories are quite compelling, in the last one, the witness actually sent in some photos of some strange tracks she found in the snow immediately following her experience. So you really want to stick around to the end, and you don't want to miss this one. So now, grab your boots because, well, it's time to ride to Cryptid Country. All right, in this first email, a witness describes his strange and unsettling encounter with a dark, human-like shadow. He writes,
Dear Tattooed Biker, I've been working in the woods for a living here in the western U.S. lately as a fire lookout in a very remote location. I'm talking a 3-mile hike to a mostly abandoned dirt road, and then another hour's drive before you even hit the pavement. This event happened last summer. Well, it was around 11 p.m. on a moonless night. Pitch black outside, and the lights of town, some 30 miles away, had mostly dimmed. It was a relatively calm night with very little wind. The tower sits atop a more or less bald spot, atop a lower peak in the middle of a burn scar. There's not much within the immediate area, besides some long grass and a smattering of younger fir trees. Well, around 11 p.m., and I'm just sitting under the glow of a propane light out on the porch, finishing up a book, when I suddenly heard a rustling coming from the hill to the south of me, about 20 degrees to my right, where there's less to see. It was just barely audible, and it sounded like it was approximately 300 feet away. It was a very sudden, and instantly sent a shiver up my spine. I went back inside and grabbed my flashlight to have a look around the catwalk. Nothing out there to see in that direction that I could detect. But that's when I suddenly saw it. Well, I say it, but I saw something. And to this day, I'm still not certain what it was, but what I do know is that it wasn't a trick of the light or of my eyes. I looked at that exact spot for the next few nights, and I never saw it again. Now keep in mind, I know my home like the back of my hand. I'm familiar with every single tree, every single shrub on my property. But on that night, out there in the distance, next to a lone boundary tree, was a vague shape, dark and ill-defined, despite the surrounding area being relatively in focus. It looked to be about 6 to 7 feet tall, broad in what I would guess would have been the shoulder area from the height. Definitely wider than a tree, and it was roughly human-shaped, but not quite right. Like it was some memory of what a human looks like from someone who hasn't seen another one in a long time. Hunched over, I watched it for what felt like forever. It didn't move, at least not initially. After a bit, though, it shifted, slowly and smoothly, to my right and behind the tree. And then it was just gone, and I never saw it again. I would have been able to see it behind the skinny tree out there if it had gone down the hill or the side hill. As I said, this relatively small snag was on its own, on a relatively gentle downslope. Now, this is an area with a lot of animals, mostly white-tailed deer and wild cows. We have a few black bears, some elk, and the occasional cougar, and a few wolves, but they tend to not let themselves be seen, and they also tend to skitter off when they think they're being observed. I've seen the predators before, but never that close to my tower. The whitetails and elk come up, but there's little in terms of food, and people are known to come here. We also have visitors and hunters, but my location in particular is only really known to locals, and it doesn't exist on public maps. The official start of the extremely overgrown and hard to follow, obviously abandoned trail is about 2 miles after a locked and unmarked gate. Hunters don't tend to come up because animals don't tend to come close. Poachers wouldn't because they're aware that we report to law enforcement. It still freaks me out a little to this day, and I really hope it was just a person or an animal in some weird circumstance, but truth be told, I don't feel too comfortable sitting outside after dark anymore. Signed, Dale.
Wow, that must have been truly unsettling to say the least. Big shout out to Dale for sharing that. So what do you guys think that Dale was seeing? Next, a witness recalls the time he saw a clothed, wrinkled, bird-like humanoid in Texas. He writes,
Hey TB, it's been a little over 20 years since we've seen this, but it's always been at the back of my mind. I'm sending this email in hopes of finding out any information to help me explain it. My mother was driving me and my 3 siblings to school. Just as we turned off our block, I realized that she was slowing down. Now over to our left is an empty lot, and that's where and when we see something that looks kind of like a bird. It was gray in color and about 5 feet tall. As we're stopped in the road, this thing just looks at us. And its face was long. It looked very old and wrinkled. It was also wearing clothes like a human. It turned away while opening its wings, and they were about as wide as the front end of our truck. It then sort of flew a few yards to our right, passing in front of us. The odd thing is that as it seemed to be flying, it never really flapped its wings. And just as soon as it crossed the road, we quickly drove off. Signed, Albert.
well, I was baffled by this encounter story, and so I sent a follow-up email, just looking for some more details, and I received the following.
Hey again, TB. This happened in September of 2004 in a small town called Levelland, Texas. It was early morning, between 7:30 and 7:45 a.m. at the time. I remember asking my mom, "Are you seeing this?" She answered yes, and then my little brother and sister in the back seat asked, "What is that?" So we all witnessed the same thing, and well, what we saw was something completely out of the ordinary. Of that, I'm certain. Thanks again. Signed, Albert.
Wow. Now that just goes to show that some reports still surprise even me. I can't even begin to guess what this bird-like humanoid could have been. It is interesting, though, that everyone in the car agreed on what they saw, and that makes this account particularly compelling. All right, now, a witness from British Columbia writes in to share a strange and terrifying sighting that she had from over a decade ago that still leaves lingering questions. She writes,
Dear Tattooed Biker, this experience is one that, well, I've never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, we were living in rural British Columbia. And one night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside, just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was wintertime, and we had just recently had a snowfall that had left knee-deep drifts. It was around 2 to 3 a.m., and out of nowhere, this very large wolf, much, much bigger than anyone that I've ever seen or heard of before by far, comes out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver, and its bright, piercing green eyes that either had a glow to them or was reflecting the light. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddocks, it locked eyes with me, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past, both alone in the middle of the night, out in the middle of nowhere. What happened next to this day instantly makes me shiver. As the wolf walked past me and towards our barn where our horses are, it became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side of the barn still had a bright light illuminating the outside so I could clearly see. This wolf, as it entered, halfway through, it went from the shape of a wolf to a very, very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person, that now stood roughly 7 feet tall, rounded the corner towards the open field, but didn't emerge from the other side, and I never saw it again. Now my brother had his own encounter with this same wolf that I'm guessing. He told me that he woke up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He quickly jumped up and looked out his window, only to find a very large wolf walking away towards the woods, so I'm guessing that it was watching him sleep. Now, this place we lived at was old native ground. Our barn was an old schoolhouse where the Catholic priest would teach the native children lessons on Christ. It still even had the old desk and chairs inside. My brother and I would both see children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn, and the lights would just turn on randomly. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, and we'd hear footsteps and have the feeling of being watched. In my room once, I actually saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling, and I hid under my covers until morning. Anyways, my main subject of this email and what I'm seeking answers about is just what did I encounter outside in the middle of the night. After I looked around myself, the closest thing that I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos. But I read these creatures have deformed features or things that make them uncanny or just straight up horrific. From what I saw, nothing struck me as abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. Now I know this is a long-winded read, and I'm sorry that I'm not a great storyteller, and there's just so much that I experienced at this property that this just scratches the surface of everything. The wolf incident is just something I've never really been able to grasp, and I've always wanted some kind of answer because, well, it sounds and feels unbelievable. I also understand that the term skinwalker is Navajo lore, and it doesn't correlate with British Columbia tribes, but it's just a representation of what I saw with the closest accuracy that I had found. Thanks for reading my long email. Signed, Tracy.
Thanks to Tracy for sharing that. A strange and terrifying mix of both cryptid and possibly paranormal experiences. Now, a North Georgia resident describes various strange incidents around his father's home in the mountains. Now, to me, his description is very similar to Bigfoot activity, and I wanted to see what you think.
Dear TB, my family has owned this lot of land near Hiawassee, Georgia since the 1980s, and my dad and his family would take vacations up there. It's completely secluded from any form of city and other life. In fact, you'd have to drive at least 2 miles on a gravel road to reach another house. There are tight, narrow woods all around, but a few more houses have sprung up since my childhood and, well, made it less scary to stay there. Anyway, this entire story starts from all the way back to my dad staying there. At the time, the place was a simple trailer, and across the gravel road led straight to the top of the mountain. And my dad would go up there a lot and just sit. He told me a story about one time when he was sitting up there, back when he was a teenager, and he hears heavy footsteps. Something that sounded identical to humans, but remember, this is far away from any other house, and this was basically their land. He said the sound first came from behind him, and then the next thing it was in front of him. He said that he jumped up, and he screamed at it to leave their land, and he said then that the footsteps disappeared. He hadn't heard anything walk off. The footsteps that had sounded right behind him and in front of him had just vanished. They were simply gone. He sprinted home and was terrified to go back out in the woods that day. Well, now it's my turn, going up the mountain. He didn't tell me this story until after, and I'm with my friend, but the trailer has literally no cell phone service at all. So my dad says maybe you can walk up to the top of the mountain, and because there's less trees, maybe I'll get good enough reception. We end up climbing it, and when we eventually get to the top, the same thing that happened to my dad starts to happen to me. First, the footsteps that sound heavy behind us, and then in front of us. But then it starts to sound like we're being surrounded, and we're terrified. And that's when we hear turkey gobbles, really far away, which, in retrospect, was weird because, well, these footsteps sounded really close and much, much heavier than a turkey. So it eased our nerves just for a second because, well, even us teenagers could take on a flock of turkeys. But then, what sounded like right in front of the trees, we hear a voice say, "Hey." Now it sounded almost like my dad, but a different version. Maybe more nasally. I didn't have time to really process that it was even my dad's voice. At the moment, I was just thinking that someone had said hey right in front of us, and we were out in rural Georgia, after hearing surrounding footsteps all around. So we both booked it back downhill and back to the trailer, not really noticing if there were footsteps following us or not because, well, it was a true flight or fight situation. It wasn't until we got back that my friend said, "Did you hear the voice too? Didn't it sound just like your dad?" My mind started racing, so I ran inside the trailer to see if my dad was inside, and sure enough, he was. I asked him if he had gone to the top of the mountain, and he hadn't. I told him what we had heard, and that's when he told me his story of what had happened to him back when he was a teenager. We never did figure out what it was. Here's something else from the same place. The living room there is basically surrounded by windows. I always hated it because, well, we didn't have blinds or curtains on all of them. And I always had the sense that someone was watching me. One night as a kid, I saw a shadow in the blinds of something, just slightly shorter than the height of the trailer, walking on two legs and very skinny in some parts. My parents made me sleep on the living room sofa a lot. On the outside of the house there were lamps, which were always turned on, and we had one orange street lamp, and I was frozen with fear. It's literally something you never want to experience again, and it was very trauma-inducing. Your heart starts racing, and every hair on your body standing and not knowing whether you should just close your eyes and wait to die, or stare at it and hope it goes away. It ended up walking past the window and didn't come back into my view. Around that same time, we were fishing at a creek near our place, and we had various rocks and sticks thrown at us. But we brushed it off as falling limbs and stuff just rolling down a hill, but now I'm wondering if it was something more. Thanks for reading. Signed, Vic.
Thanks to Vic for sharing this. In my opinion, this was most likely just Bigfoot activity, mimicking walking around a residence at night, sticks and stones being thrown, etc. You see, Hiawassee is up in North Georgia, up against the Appalachian Mountains, in an area that's well known for Bigfoot activity, but that's just my thoughts. I'm sure Vic would like to hear your thoughts and theories down in the comments below. And now finally, Tay Fay of the Musqueam First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada. Well, she shared a strange and disturbing experience that happened in March of last year, and she sent some amazing photographic evidence that she took near her grandparents' home. She writes,
Hey, Tattooed Biker. So last March, I heard my dogs barking, something crazy in the middle of the night. At what, I still don't know, but they were really going crazy. And then things got really creepy when I heard a strange, deep and rumbling growl. It was a sound that I've never heard before, and certainly not from them. I woke up the next morning to find one of them dead. I'm not 100% sure how he died, as there weren't any visible wounds, but I think he had to probably be injured from whatever it was. Maybe? I just don't know. The next morning, I found these tracks all around the property. Do you have any idea of what these tracks are? I personally think it's a Bigfoot, but everyone has their own opinions. Not to mention, the snow was just above my knees while taking these photos. I was, and am, still pretty creeped out. I just wanted to share. Signed, Tay.
Now, in my opinion, those tracks would be very difficult for anything other than a very, very tall bipedal creature to have made. The stride length is huge, and given the unmarked surrounding snow, almost impossible to have been hoaxed. Thanks, Tay, for sharing your story and those amazing photos. Well, that's all the true cryptid encounter stories and reports that I have for you this evening. As always, I'm anxious to read your thoughts and theories down in the comments below, but please, keep it respectful to the witnesses. And if you have an unexplained encounter, or maybe a bizarre experience that you want to share, just send it to the email address in the description and, well, your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks so much for taking this strange journey with me through cryptid country. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.